Good afternoon and welcome. I'm John Griffin, the Faculty Director of the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs. The CWA is a week-long festival of ideas, free and open to the public, held here on the CU Boulder campus each spring. This year's conference will be held Monday, April 6th to Friday, April 10th. So please mark your calendars, and we hope you'll join us for what is shaping up to be a fantastic 72nd year of the CWA. The CWA is honored to be collaborating with the law school on today's panel on the effect of government surveillance on civil and human rights, both in the U.S. and in other countries. This is the fourth edition of the John and Katherine Rosenbloom Endowed Lectureship here at CU Law. I want to thank John and Kathy for their very generous support of both the law school and the CWA. So let's please give them a hand for making today's event possible. I also want to thank part of the army of folks that have worked behind the scenes on today's event, including Georgette Vigil and Yesenia Delgado from the law school, and Katie Grady, Aaron Rain, Alan Culpepper, and Lindsay Vischer from CWA for all their hard work. Thank you as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's panel discussion, who's the Dean of CU Law, James Anaya. A graduate of Harvard Law School, Dean Anaya has written extensively on international human rights and issues concerning indigenous peoples. Among his numerous publications are his acclaimed book, Indigenous Peoples in International Law, published by Oxford University Press, and his widely used textbook, International Human Rights, Problems of Law, Policy, and Process, which is in its 6th edition. Over the course of his illustrious career, Dean Anaya has represented indigenous groups in landmark cases before domestic and international tribunals, including the United States Supreme Court and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Dean Anaya participated in the drafting of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and as a UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2008 to 2014, he monitored the human rights conditions of indigenous peoples worldwide and addressed situations in which their rights were being violated. In 2014, for all this work, Dean Anaya was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. For his many accomplishments, Dean Anaya was recently named a distinguished professor, which is the highest honor that the University of Colorado bestows upon its faculty. With that, I will yield the floor to Dean Anaya, and I hope you enjoy today's discussion.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. John is actually an alumnus of the law school, so I have influence over him to say those kinds of things. Welcome back to the law school, John. It's always great to have you here, and it's wonderful for us to be associating with the Conference on World Affairs for this event, and I'd like to add my thanks to John and Kathy Rosenbloom for their generosity and for establishing the Endowed Lectureships, which makes this event possible. Thank you very much. This lectureship series actually started from a pretty modest affair to what you see here today, a major event with a stellar panel, including a panelist, as I'll introduce in a moment, or say in a moment, piping in from Hong Kong. So, hi there. So I'd like to say a special welcome to all the alums who are here with us. This is homecoming weekend, and so it's a special occasion for us to be able to welcome back alums from over the years, and we have alums from going back 60 plus years. The one who's more than 60 years asked me not to say how many more years, but let's just say 60 plus years back. We have graduates from from back. And those of you who aren't alums, welcome as well. And if you made your way here through the Conference on World Affairs, a special welcome, and we appreciate your support and interest in that fantastic program at the university. And a welcome to all the students. John told me, maybe I wasn't supposed to say this, but he teaches a big class in American politics, and he encouraged many of them to be here. So welcome to you, all of you who are here. It's great to have you at the law school, and maybe we'll see you actually one day enrolled here with us at the law school. And of course, welcome to all of the law students who are in the room and the rest of the law school community. So with that, let's turn to the subject of this afternoon. Today, the world faces a series of human and civil rights challenges within or as a result of countries' surveillance efforts that are exacerbated or that have increased in the current climate. What is the current technological capacity of governments to conduct surveillance? How does this enhanced capacity potentially infringe upon accepted norms of privacy? What challenges does it raise to respect the human and international or human and civil rights that are recognized in international and domestic law? These are just some of the questions that this panel will be discussing today. I'm going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves in a moment, but first, please join me in welcoming first Dr. Keith Guzik, and he will appear from the curtains. Actually, he's not the one on the panel. This is him right here. He's not the one on the screen. This is Dr. Keith Guzik. Yeah. And also Dr. Guzik, an associate professor at the University of Colorado at Denver. His areas of expertise include criminology, law and society, science and technology studies, sociological theory, and qualitative methods. And he'll explain what all that means in a moment. Join me also in welcoming Danielle Jefferis. Danielle is a teaching fellow at the Civil Rights Clinic at the University of Denver's Sturm College of Law. Before joining the Denver Law Faculty, DU Law Faculty, Danielle was the Nadine Strossen Fellow with the American Civil Liberties Union National Security Project in New York. Welcome. Next, join me in welcoming Amie Stepanovich. She is the executive director of the Silicon Flatiron Center, the law school Silicon Flatiron Center, which is one of the stellar centers that we have here at Colorado Law. She is a nationally recognized expert in domestic surveillance, cybersecurity, and privacy law. And now you can join me in welcoming the person on the screen, Paul Moser. And he's joining us, I suspect, from a hotel room in Hong Kong by the looks of it, but welcome. He is a New York Times journalist and a technology reporter for the New York Times based in Shanghai. And my notes here say he will participate by video, but we've already noted that, okay. He writes about Asia's biggest tech companies and covers cybersecurity, emerging internet cultures, censorship, and the intersection of geopolitics and technology law in Asia. Is this working? Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm going to invite each of our panelists to make an opening statement of 5 to 8 minutes, and in the course of doing that, they'll each talk a little bit more about themselves. So why don't we start with Keith.
Thank you very much. I'll make sure that the mic's on at an appropriate level. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, let's work on it. Is that better? Got a little bit. I'll just, I was going to sing and see if we got the right volume, but I think we're good now. So first of all, thank you, Dina and Aya, for the invitation, as well as the Rosenblooms for sponsoring the talk today, and John Griff for extending the invitation. It's really great to see this room full of people interested in this topic that all of us here dedicated some of our mental energy and time to. The first thing I want to say about myself, I'm a sociology professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. And as a sociologist, that puts me in a little bit of a different disciplinary background than the other panelists. But as a way of introducing the points I wanted to make today, I really wanted to raise 3 points to start out with. First, as a sociologist, we tend to do, and Dina Naya said I would explain a little bit of these words about qualitative research. As a qualitative researcher, one thing that I like to do is to go and do field work and see, in this case, law at work. So traditionally, sociologists might go and study police, observe police interactions with citizens, so on and so forth. As an opening point, what I want to say is studying surveillance is difficult. No one ever advised me on that in graduate school, so I made the foolish choice of taking one of my first projects post-graduate school and studying surveillance. And the reason why it's difficult to study is it's, for something based on vision, it's difficult to see. That is that the state actors who we're interested in talking about today are very secretive, so it's hard to get access to watch them work like sociologists would normally like to do. And then oftentimes, as Paul studies, we have private companies who, of course, have their rights and claims upon the technologies that they're looking to sell in the marketplace. So it's hard to actually observe these actors in practice like we normally do. Saying that, that's the first point. To a second point, in terms of the topic of today's panel, the relationship between surveillance technologies and rights, as a sociologist who studies law topics, we generally have understood that for rights to matter in something like surveillance, a few basic conditions tend to be needed. First, we need what we call legal consciousness of rights. This means that ordinary people like yourselves and myself are aware that there are rights, like a Fourth Amendment right, which protects us against abuses from state authorities or private authorities for that matter. In addition to legal consciousness, we need the avenues within the legal system to be able to bring forth the abuses that we identify in our lives to authorities who could hear those matters. And this is a matter of access to justice. So we not only need legal consciousness among the population, but access to justice as well. And here I will shamelessly plug a sociologist, Rebecca Sandifer, who's at the University of Illinois, who got a MacArthur Genius Foundation grant last year because she's studying access to justice issues across the country, and she just sent out an email the other day for research in this area from scholars across the country. And then the third thing that we need is forums in which these claims that come forward from citizens who have identified abuses to be heard. And here we talk about different types of justices and different forms of justice that can be practiced in courtrooms and other venues in which claims can be heard. And so these conditions need to be present in society for rights to matter. And it's interesting that I find myself here in a law school in which most people in this room have dedicated themselves at one level or another to make sure that those things happen in our society. The third point I would say is that in the places that I really like to study, which are globally, these conditions that I just mentioned are oftentimes absent. And to give you an example, so my experience studying surveillance was largely formed in Mexico. 2 administrations ago, the Mexican federal government launched the war on organized crime, and they had a score of programs that they were looking to do to sort of stem the tide against organized crime. The 3 that I studied were first a automobile registration program, which would place an RFID chip onto every single vehicle in the country so that when it was when a vehicle was going by a certain transit point, it would automatically register with that program. So this would help you with drug trafficking or arms trafficking, and so on and so forth. The second program that I was studying was a national ID program. And this was simply an effort to give everyone in the country a uniform national ID. We can think about that relative to the United States, where we have largely our primary identification card is issued at the state level rather than the federal level. Mexico was in a similar spot. And then the third program was a national cellular phone registry, where when I went to do my research there, and others in Mexico were invited to text back to the government their identifying information so that their telephones could be kept in the registry. And this was done specifically to combat, well, ostensibly to combat kidnappings, that if someone got kidnapping then, and someone stole their phone, you'd be able to locate the phone and find where the kidnappers were. In studying these programs, what I found was that I went there really looking to study what the topic of today. How did people feel about these technologies in a situation of high crime like Mexico finds itself? When I got there, what I was surprised to find is that very few people knew about the programs. The Cellular phone registry was a national scandal, but the other two programs largely fell below the radar. And that reflected the fact that the programs themselves largely failed in the end. And to cut a long story short here, I have a book on it that's open access, so you don't have to pay for it if you ever want to read it through the University of California Press. There's forces, the point would be is that there are forces other than rights and formal law which work against those in power. And one of those, which happened in Mexico, was basic citizen distrust of government authorities. They were very unwilling to cooperate in any manner with these programs on a large scale, which was required because they basically thought, with a lot of historical precedents, that the government was not secure and they would lose their data and it would end up in the hands of criminals. So they didn't cooperate. The other point that I'll just make quickly is that the government itself often got in the way of its own success. And so when the administration 2 administrations ago launched this, it was from an opposition party, and the programs then became political hot potatoes, and it served as an opportunity for the other political parties in the country to oppose and delegitimize that regime because they were failing. And so I have other points to make about it, but it's just to say that oftentimes these technologies themselves fail for technical reasons, for citizen distrust, and then for the government themselves not being able to actually administer them properly. I'll leave it there for now, and then I'll look forward to the points of the other.
Thank you, Keith. Danielle.
Thank you. Are we good? Okay. Thank you so much for having me here today. As Dean and I mentioned, my name is Danielle Jefferis. I teach in the Civil Rights Clinic at the University of Denver College of Law, just down the road from here. In my role at the clinic, I work with law students litigating federal civil rights cases on behalf of people who are incarcerated. But prior to this role, I worked with the ACLU's National Security Project in New York, where my focus was on post 9/11 surveillance, and particularly in the realm of community profiling and targeting and the intersection of surveillance and the criminal legal system. So today I want to focus on a couple or one particular surveillance program and the theory or justification underpinning it to highlight the ways in which surveillance really impacts communities and can be furthered despite very faulty science or very faulty justifications underneath it. And so this program that I want to focus on, particularly on the federal government level, is called Countering Violent Extremism. It's also known as counter-radicalization, and there are a number of versions of it across the world. The United Kingdom has one of the original counter-radicalization programs known as PREVENT, and now the United States has had Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE, in place for about 8 years formally. So yeah, like I said, the federal government launched CVE in 2011, and it launched it to, there was a big press release, a pretty public-facing announcement that the government was launching this program, and it pitched it as a quote-unquote soft terrorism strategy, or a soft counterterrorism strategy, and tasked a number of federal agencies, upwards of approximately 10 by our count, with executing this program. And it branded it as a community strengthening or a community building resilience program, and said the aim of which was to, quote, prevent ideologically motivated violence by strengthening communities. So in other words, the government viewed CVE as this strategy aimed to empower communities to identify people within them who were likely to commit violence before they did. The government quickly implemented pilot projects in Boston, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis, And from that point, that's really where the information sharing stopped. We didn't know anything about the way in which these agencies were expected to execute the programs. We didn't know where the funding was coming from. We didn't know where the funding was going. We didn't know really anything beyond what the Obama administration had publicly announced in 2011. So that's where I got involved with this program. The ACLU had made a FOIA request to 7 agencies across the federal government: Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, the Health and Human Services, for any and all information about what CVE is intended to do and be. And we got nothing. And so we had to resort to litigation, and we filed a case in 2016 demanding that the government turn over responsive documents. That case is still ongoing. We got a number of rolling productions, which are still happening, have been happening since I left that role, but the document total is in the tens of thousands of pages at this point, and the program keeps shifting, as you might imagine. So it started as an Obama administration program, and the Trump administration has furthered it and in fact, changed it in a number of ways. And so thankfully, due to the work of the ACLU and also the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, we know a little bit more about what the Trump administration is using CVE for. So right now, what we know about CVE on the federal level is that approximately 85% of just the grants that DHS has awarded are going to target American Muslim communities and other minority groups. And these other minority groups now in the Trump administration include Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ groups, immigrants, attorneys, and a number of folks who the administration views as warranting enhanced surveillance. We know, and this has been a consistent trait since the program was launched in 2011, that a majority of the federally supported programs are premised on this conclusion or this theory that diversity and the experience of discrimination or targeting in the United States is suggestive of a threat of violence. So the theory is that if you have been a victim of discrimination, if you have views that are hostile or perhaps critical of the government, you might be someone who is likely to commit a violent act in the future. We also know that about now $2.5 billion of CVE funding is going directly to law enforcement agencies. So you've got a federal government program that is intended, at least in theory, to strengthen communities, but the majority of funding is going directly to law enforcement agencies to carry out the program. We also know that at least 14 out of 26 programs that are receiving funding are targeting schools and students. And so what that means is that the government is going to schools and saying, look, teachers and administrators, we need you to watch out for students who are expressing ideas that we believe signal a threat of future violence. Relatedly, we also know that 12 programs focus on mental health providers. And so we are deputizing social workers and mental health providers as well as teachers and school administrators to look out for these signs of violence or a future threat. So what are the problems with CVE? I want to focus on 2 of them. I think there are a lot, but I want to focus briefly on 2. I think the first one is that these programs target ideas and speech, and they profile communities. So the idea is that you're surveilling people and communities for certain indicators of what the government views as a risk of violence. By definition, almost, that is targeting ideas or speech that people are expressing because they haven't yet committed the violent act, but we are looking for signs that they will. And predominantly, this is looking to folks' ideas and speech. For example, a core component, as I think I mentioned, of CVE involves requiring or asking teachers and social and mental health workers to monitor kids in their care. And these are kids as young as 5 years old. We've seen these programs being implemented in elementary schools and other settings across the country where teachers are being asked to listen to the kids in the lunchroom, in the classroom, and report on what ideas they're expressing. We also know from leaked National Counterterrorism Center document that the government had developed a 5-point scale or rubric for folks to grade the threat of violence. And some of the factors were, quote, a perceived sense of being treated unjustly, end quote, quote, expressions of hopelessness, futility, and despair, end quote, and, quote, connection to group identity, race, nationality, religion, or ethnicity, end quote. So these are the factors that the government is asking people, deputizing people to grade other people on, to surveil them on, to then judge and assess whether they are likely to commit a violent act. The second problem that I want to just highlight, and I'm happy to talk about further during Q&A, but the entire premise of this program of CVE, of the idea that you can identify someone who's going to commit a violent act before they do, is based on junk science. It's based on theories that have been roundly debunked. It is actually counter to a number of theories that have actually been proven or are on the road of being proven. The premise being that the adoption or expression of extreme or radical ideas places people on this path to violence, and that there are observable indicators, such as the ones in the NCTC document, to identify people who might engage in terrorism or violence is false. There are no proven indicators of violence. There is no proven path to violence. It is a very multifaceted situation, and it has been roundly debunked. And so, relatedly, if you're basing a federal government on faulty science, you're not going to see proven results of it, and that is in fact true. There are no proven results of CVE. We can point to no threats or risks that have been mitigated because of CVE or anything like that. And so I'll wrap up now, but I think that as we're thinking about surveillance today and its impact on or intersection with civil and human rights, I think we also have to think about these sorts of government programs that target communities and really interrogate the principles on which they're built and the theories and justifications that the government uses to support them.
Thanks. Thank you, Danielle. No, Amie.
Good afternoon, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Just echoing the thanks to Dean and Naya, to the Rosenblooms, to John and Georgette, wherever you are, all the organizers for bringing us here together. And really a thanks to all of you. I was given the great honor of being asked to come be the new head of Silicon Flatirons, and I started this past July. And both at the law school and the greater community in general, it's been nothing but the warmest of welcomes since I came from DC, which is not necessarily the warmest of places. Not weather-wise, this is actually much colder. So it's been really great being here. But before I came here, I worked at an organization looking at technology and human rights, specifically with a focus on privacy and government surveillance. Now, it's not where I started my career. I started my career much at a law school like this one, across the country in New York, trying to figure out what I was going to do and figuring out, like, I really want to work on government surveillance programs. I have a real passion for this issue. And at the time, nobody really cared. In fact, my mother was like, she does that kind of technology Facebook stuff. That's how she described the work that I did. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do that coming out of law school. And then this person who you may know, you may have heard of him, his name is Edward Snowden, came out and started revealing a lot of abuses that were happening at the US government level on surveillance. And all of a sudden, everybody knew what I did, which was really wonderful, which is all just a story to the law students or future law students in the room. Do what you want to do. Eventually, people will pay attention. I want to take some of the issues that Danielle was talking about in internal surveillance, the US looking internally, and talk more about them in the external frame, the international frame, which is, again, the world that I come from. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, is the human rights document that we mostly look at as protecting rights of privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of association, religion, et cetera, internationally. Most countries around the world have signed on to this document in some form, including the United States, and it's been around for decades and just is largely assumed to be the foundational human rights document on the rights that we're talking about. The issue is the United States primarily has determined that this document and the rights in it are only ascribed to people within the United States. So under their official interpretation, nobody outside of the country possesses human rights. They don't have to respect those human rights, and they can conduct any programs they want that may interfere with the alleged human rights that these people do not possess. In practice, what that means is there's a lot of mass surveillance the US conducts focused outside of the United States, and they can collect information broadly from just about anybody without showing that that person meets any level or standard or demonstrating a burden of proof for collecting that information. And because the United States is the United States, we are largely considered to be one of the human rights leaders around the world. When the US interprets its human rights obligations in a certain way, other countries will pick up that interpretation, and it becomes the de facto standard globally. And it's not only a US issue. We're a member of a group called the Five Eyes. That's EYES, not I''S. The Five Eyes consists of the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand as a partnership that basically form the most powerful surveillance apparatus in the world. And between those 5 countries have a reach that covers the entire world, which is why they've picked those 5. A lot of people wonder, why is New Zealand thrown in there? Because they have access to those specific internet cables that maybe they wouldn't be able to get a hold of otherwise. So as not only this human rights leader, a member of this most powerful surveillance apparatus, this interpretation gets picked up in countries, including incredibly repressive regimes, who may have signed on to these human rights documents, can use that as political cover in their own surveillance activities. And we see this happen. And what I don't want to say is, if the US didn't have this interpretation, that other countries would be better, because that's not necessarily the case. I do want to say that the US, in picking up this interpretation, means that there is absolutely zero pressure and a lot of cover for some really bad activities happening in other governments. So for example, back in 2015, China, and I'm trying to provide a little bit of jumping point for the next panelist, China passed a Cybersecurity Act that essentially said that companies have to be able to turn over any evidence that they ask for, whether or not the company may have cybersecurity provisions that prevent them from getting access to it or not, trying to determine what security measures that private companies take over your personal information. When they passed that, their rationale for passing that law is the US already can do this, so why should we not do it? That was a false statement. The US actually doesn't have that authority yet, but they were able to provide that cover because we've been discussing it, and globally the idea was that we did have that authority, and it facilitated greater acceptance of what is a really repressive law that could have global cybersecurity impact. In the US, it allows us to conduct a program called Fisa Amendments Act Section 702, actually 2 programs under that authority. For those who were paying attention back in 2013, this was the second Snowden revelation that came out. You may know it as the PRISM revelation. Essentially, it says, or it allows governments to go to private companies and order massive amounts of information to be turned over related to certain identifiers. But more nefariously, they are able to put taps on the internet cables coming and going from the United States to scan, collect temporarily and scan all of the internet traffic for these identifiers to determine if certain information is included in your traffic, and if it's located in there, they're able to pick it up and retain it. Now again, this is a program that is targeted outside the US, but has massive implications for people in the United States, and is able to be conducted because they don't see it as needing to protect any rights outside the US. And so the US impact is seen as largely secondary. And in fact, when they reanalyzed this program very recently, and they had determined that there had been potentially some violations and abuses and great potential for greater abuse, instead of reining it in, they actually expanded and codified, further expansions of the program and more capability of other agencies, primarily the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, to access the database of the information that they were storing coming out of this program. I want to end with my starting remarks with some positive statements, because generally when I talk about surveillance, people say that it's really, really negative and they walk out of the room super depressed. So rather than waiting for the end, I want to talk about things that provide checks or could provide checks on these programs. One is that the ICCPR that I started talking about has what's called the first optional protocol. The key word there is optional. Governments that subscribe to the ICCPR do not have to join this protocol as well, and many of them don't. The United States doesn't. Australia does, and as a member of the Five Eyes, that's important. The protocol allows people to challenge interpretations of state law under human rights documents. And so it provides a lever to pull on Australia's interpretations of these programs that can impact international surveillance operations. Another positive thing, super obscure executive order 13107. I'm telling you, there are government agencies in the United States or officials who really hate me because I found this executive order. It states that all government agencies have to have a point of contact to approach on human rights violations. Most of them have never done that. DHS, I think, took 10 years to finally appoint a human rights point of contact, and they're the only agency that has one. So we have written to several others, the NSA, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and asked them who their human rights point of contact was. We got one response. The response was, we have somebody who you can talk to about civil liberties violations, period. They got very angry when we called that a non-response, but it provides more room to push agencies on what they're doing and what their interpretations are. These are minimal positives in a world where the power dynamics are so shifted in favor of governments, and the secrecy that we're talked about and we're going to continue to talk about really makes it hard to challenge things. But in this space, you have to kind of grab onto those little things and try to make little incremental improvements over time. And so I do want to talk about those in opening and look forward to the continued discussion.
Great, thank you, Amie, for ending on a positive note in terms of the kind of strategies that can be used moving forward. And now it's my pleasure to turn the table over to Paul Moser of the New York Times. Paul, coming from Hong Kong.
Yeah, thanks. I hope I'm sending some Snowden vibes from a hotel room in Hong Kong. So, yeah, so I've been in Asia for about 13 years, covering technology here. And over that time, I've run around a lot of the region, looking at different ways the technology is used. And most recently, surveillance has really come to the fore. Last year, we were looking at sort of Facebook in Myanmar and its connection to the genocide there. But really, the biggest story for me over the past couple of years has been the metastasization of the surveillance state within China. And I think maybe it's useful to just sort of start with some context about the Chinese political system, just so that as we talk about this, we kind of understand, because all technology is ultimately based on the sort of underlying political systems in which it's being used. So really, with China over the past 6 or 7 years, there's been a kind of marked change in the politics here. It was an authoritarian country. It's gotten much more authoritarian. Under the head of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, basically he abolished term limits and ultimately kind of has tried to close down a lot of the spaces for dialogue that had existed under previous leaders. And so that sort of rise has happened at a sort of the same moment that the Chinese startup ecosystem really started flourishing. And so we saw a model for development of innovation that's very, very closely linked to the United States and follows what you see out of Silicon Valley. And so you have these kind of twin forces happening at the same time. And it's a bit odd because it's very rare that you see a very closed off authoritarian government able to host such a kind of big flourishing of technology. And so what that's meant is Xi has sort of consolidated his powers, that he has tried to turn to technology and use all of these new capabilities that have come up as a way to kind of secure control over people in the country. And so effectively what that has meant is in the past few years, you've really started to see some pretty big changes within China. And I think the biggest thing is that you see cameras hanging from just about every intersection in the major cities. China went from having, almost none of the most surveilled cities in the world to now 8 out of the 10 most surveilled cities in the world. We're expecting probably there will be somewhere in the order of 600 million surveillance cameras set up in the country by the end of 2020. And so you have a system, a world where basically any given intersection is more surveilled than Times Square effectively. And so that's one physical way where you can actually see this. Oftentimes, though, it's invisible. There are phone trackers set up, tens of thousands of phone trackers set up across Chinese cities, which are grabbing information on people's phones without their knowledge. There are license plate trackers, which again, the US has, pulling in data as well. And what's I think important to realize about China is in a political system where there are no democratic checks on these things, a lot of these systems have been able to be put in place completely without people's awareness. But at the same time, because it's a fundamentally communist-based system, the party is able to use propaganda to sort of chide people into the idea that this is okay and acceptable and important. Oftentimes they sort of raise the prospect of danger in the community and crime, when in reality, a lot of these neighborhoods are quite safe. And, it was interesting the other day, we were in a town where they had set up a facial recognition system to get people in and out of their residences, a sort of residential building. And we talked to the local party chief. And again, governance extends to a very local level. So this is a community of 7,000 people, and it has a Communist Party committee of about 12 people. And so we were talking to the leader of that group, and we said, well, a lot of people here seem not to be happy about this. The old people had actually propped open the doors because they didn't know how to use the facial recognition system. So you have wire and plywood propping open doors, and then a nice sort of facial recognition system that is going unused because they don't want to use it. So we're talking to her about this, and she says, well, a lot of people disagreed, but then we did some thought work, and ultimately they came to see our point of view. And then this is the way that fundamentally that the party views how people work and how governance works, which is that you can control people and that you can convince them and bring them around, and that there is a sort of fundamental ability to change how people think and who they are. And I think, so under that sort of outlook, the idea of rule of law doesn't really apply. It's very much a sort of, rule by law, which means that law is sort of asserted on people when you need to, when you want to. And what's interesting about that is that makes China in some ways a more free place than the United States, or for a long time it has, because laws don't apply to people very frequently. So you could run around and get in a fight in the streets, and you're not going to go to jail for assault. The police will probably drag you in and make you pay for the hospital bills of the loser of the fight, for instance. So rule of law as we know it is much more loosely applied and oftentimes mediated at a local community level. So law really, in some ways isn't an actual sort of force. And so this surveillance becomes very important in that context, because what she wants to do is bring these rules and make them apply more broadly. And so surveillance has become a major implement of a police force that it just doesn't have enough people, and that is very focused on the maintenance of social stability to be able to affect that change. And then the most extreme version, and I'm going to end on a negative to contrast, is what has happened out in the western part of the country in Xinjiang. And Xinjiang is sort of, I don't know, maybe probably some people have read about this. We've done a lot of coverage of this over the past year, a few years actually. But Xinjiang is the sort of desert region, sort of fringed by the Himalayas, a huge dune sea in the center of it. It sort of borders Afghanistan and Pakistan and Kazakhstan. And there's a minority group there known as the Uyghurs. And so there's been a long sort of conflict over the Uyghurs see themselves as a separate culture from the Chinese. They've been independent over the course of their history at different times. It's a fairly colonial sort of situation there, where the Chinese have been in power there for the past 60 or so years. And there's been a lot of sort of fighting over expressions of local culture and discrimination and so on. And so there's some outbreaks of sort of very sort of small level terrorism. And in response to that, the Chinese government in 2017 sent a new politician to head the region, and he began to crack down on the region very harshly. And in the course of that crackdown, he sent more than 1 million Uyghurs without any kind of trials to camps. And then some of them go on to prisons. The conditions in these camps are quite bad. But the sort of, if that's the stick, the other stick in the system, there's no real carrots here, is a massive surveillance apparatus. So you have a place that was, very, very underdeveloped. And instead of, say, developing toilets or helping with modern agricultural techniques, what you get is extremely high-powered artificial intelligence cameras hanging from, every 200 meters of any given city. You have checkpoints that went in that use a national ID system, which again is one of the very fundamental building blocks of the Chinese sort of system of control of its people. And then you have large databases where files on every single person are kind of assembled and kept. And then you have these sort of command and control systems that use the cameras and use other tracking systems to be able to kind of monitor where police are, where normal people are, and kind of keep tabs on them at all times. And when you talk to locals about this, they sort of describe it as an open air prison. And the technology itself becomes an almost implement of fear. And because this is China and things aren't always executed perfectly well, China is a place where, especially with the large kind of government bureaucracy, people don't necessarily know how to use technology all that well. So you don't know if the technology is being used right. You don't know if the cameras are connecting to anything. You don't know if facial recognition is really being used on a lot of these systems. And from our research, maybe about 10% right now, it's sort of 10% penetration of the sort of higher level AI surveillance. But because you don't know, it becomes a way to intimidate people. The fact that you have a camera outside somebody's door, they don't know if there's anybody watching it or not. But the fact that you don't know kind of generates enough fear and uncertainty in itself to cow people into sort of just cooperation or sort of basically willingness to go along with the authorities. And what's fascinating is that you have a propaganda system that is able to then pump up the effectiveness of this technology. So they'll come out and claim the technology is highly effective, and people will read that and then just believe it, even if it may not be. So the technology doesn't always have to work to have an impact, especially in these sorts of situations. And the final thing I'd close with is just that we've also looked at these systems are now being sold overseas via Huawei, for instance, makes these systems, but a bunch of other Chinese companies do as well. And so we went to Ecuador to watch one of these systems and how it was used in a different country that's sort of struggling with democratic issues. And it's fascinating because ultimately it gives an immense amount of political power. And the ostensible reason that you create this technology, which is to say stop crime, it's much easier to abuse the technology and to use it to target political rivals because you have to follow 6 political rivals, say, as opposed to 100,000 people who might be robbing each other. So it becomes much, much easier to use this to go after political opponents than it does to do the real hard work that this stuff is purported to be about. So yeah, I hope that like sort of lays the groundwork, and then we can kind of go from there
very much so.
as we kind of delve into it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and it's good of you to join us from far away. Thank you each of you for informative and very thought-provoking words that you provided us. What we see is, I guess you could say, on one level, the dark side or a dark side of technology. We talk a lot, including in conferences in this room, about the positive attributes of technology and how it's in many ways improved lives. And we're thanks for the few words of positive words getting us there, but mostly it's sort of a humdrum kind of. We're talking about technology and surveillance technology in particular gone too far. But I guess there's sort of I don't know if this is the right metaphor, elephant or something in the room, buffalo in the room, and that is we need security apparatuses to work effectively given the real problems faced in the world and faced by the United States. There was this thing that happened on 9/11. We have theater shootings. We have mass shootings in schools, by young people. And so there is a need for some kind of, some measures that are aimed at providing us security. Now, this is distinct, I think, from what Paul was talking about, where you have simply outright technology and surveillance technology being used to oppress and control people, as in the situation of the Uyghurs. But in a democratic society in the United States, one that very much aspires to be democratic, and that's our sort of a common ethos that we share in the country, there is this sense of an urgency that requires technology to be harnessed to provide security, and this surveillance technology is front and center. So, I throw that out to the panelists to talk about the possible balance to be struck, and how do we approach striking a balance? Because we cannot just simply ignore or cast aside the security needs, the real security needs that exist. And then related to that, I'd like to direct a question to Danielle in particular. You mentioned the faulty methodology that's used through this program, the CVE program, and the use of particular factors in order to identify, as understood, potential violence. And among them was despair exhibited by young people. And when you were saying that, I started thinking about the kind of indicators that educators are called upon to look for in youth in the schools in order to avert the kind of mass violence or shootings that we've seen in the schools. That seems to be one of the indicators, despair or certain kind of indicia along those lines. And so if you could comment on that as well. But where's the balance, and how do we get to that balance?
I don't know if I'm that, there we go. I think there's a question here about what is legitimate, necessary, measured rights protecting surveillance, and what is security theater. And security theater is all of that stuff that makes you feel like you're really, really safe, but doesn't do a lot. And I think the main example, and you talked about 9/11, so I'll talk about two examples coming out of that. One was, if you've been to an airport in the last 19 years, you've gone through a body scanner. Has anybody here not gone through a body scanner in an airport? Wonderful. And they were put there to say, you are no longer going to be able to get these devices onto airplanes. We're going to be able to scan everything. Most people in security will tell you they are trivially easy to bypass in order to get prohibited items onto airplanes. In addition, the number one thing that people recommended post 9/11 that would have actually prevented it from happening is a reinforced cockpit door, which has no surveillance implications whatsoever and actually could have provided real security measures, and does. They did implement that. But they had to do this theater piece on the outside that didn't necessarily make anybody on airplanes any safer, and in fact may make people in airports a lot less secure, because what they're doing is they're creating a big target zone in the form of security lines at airports. And we saw that because now terrorists are actually attacking the security lines rather than waiting to get the devices on the planes. And so it creates a whole different issue. Another thing that came out of 9/11 was the Patriot Act. And from the Patriot Act, we get the Call Detail Records Program, which was the first Snowden revelation that said that basically the National Security Agency, the NSA, was collecting information on every single phone call that transited the United States, that either started or stopped in the United States. So any call you guys made during that period was being collected and put in a database somewhere. Overwhelmingly, people agree this program didn't actually do anything to stop attacks. But rather than stop it, when it was revealed, we reformed it. We said you should maybe still get access to some of this information, but not all of it. Let's target it down a little bit. And that was great, except post the reform, What we've realized is there are even more abuses coming out about this program, and that they've had to shut down large parts of it. They've had to purge the entire database at least twice because they were collecting information they shouldn't have been collecting. And top-ranking officials at all of the intelligence agencies have said, just shut the program down. It's not helpful. We don't need it. It takes resources away from programs that are helpful, and we're not using it for anything. But there was a hearing on it this week because the authority expires on December 31st of this year, so Congress has to reauthorize it. It's probably the only thing Congress is going to do at the end of the year. So there was a hearing on it this week, and even though like agreement is this is not a useful program, the people they had testified not only called for it to be renewed, they called it to be renewed permanently. So we could never reanalyze it in Congress again. Again, this is not something that's making us safer. We have evidence that it's not.
But is all, say, surveillance theater? Are all cameras, surveillance cameras theater?
They are if they're not turned on.
Yeah. Well, so I was just, one example came to mind for me, which is when we were in Ecuador, we were looking at these Chinese surveillance systems, and we went into the sort of local barrios, these neighborhoods, which are quite dangerous, some of them. And we spoke with the very, very local community leaders there. And one of them had been mugged in front of a camera. So a man sort of put a knife to her throat and another man robbed her, and there was a camera right in front of her. And the police did not respond in any way. Nothing happened. And yet still, a half a year later, she was calling for cameras to be installed in her neighborhood. And so you kind of put it to her, well, like, you have direct experience of this technology not functioning in your life, and yet here you are asking for this stuff. And I think, her point was that, well, the government should do something. And even if the real way to fix this is to create an effective policing system that's not corrupt and that actually patrols the poor areas, we're not going to get that. So at least we can get some cameras out of it. And so there's this way that I think it's a very human way to just kind of throw, there's a solutionism to at least having something. And there's a way that tech can kind of fill that need in some ways, even if it isn't ultimately all that effective. And so it works very well in democratic situations as well, because it scratches an itch. Like, people want to feel secure, even if they're not. And if there's something there, it makes you feel that. But I think that most of the time it's not helping all that much.
Right. Maybe I watch too many Mission Impossible movies and TV. But I mean, are you saying that there is no surveillance technology that is useful? I mean, is that the case? I mean, is it a matter of implementing it well and in a measured way?
Normally, if the targeted surveillance measures are much better, they take fewer resources and they dig in to where there are actually problems. These mass programs tend to create more issues than they solve because they're building the haystacks that then you have to search through to find the needles. And so targeted surveillance, human intelligence is actually more than signals intelligence, has been able to break through some of the more sophisticated crime syndicates. If you think about dark web activities and criminal enterprises that are being conducted using technology, it's human intelligence that has overwhelmingly been the source of breaking into those and determining where people are located and how to go after them. It's not the mass activities. Those are things that are out there to make people feel better.
Sure.
This is
So,
and so
our technologies are working now.
the point you raise is a good one. I'm usually more critically minded, so I don't want to leave too much of an open mind for invasive technologies actually working. But going back to the points I started with, it's an empirical question of which technologies work and not. In fields like criminology, where I was mentioning earlier in a backroom discussion that I also study body-worn cameras by the police, there is a lot of money that the Obama administration put into the actual research of these programs. And so for sociologists and criminologists like myself, this is nice because you can do social scientific studies to see what these technologies are doing. And again, back to the earlier point, the problem with secret programs is there's not a call for proposals that go out by the federal government to identify which ones are working, which ones aren't. And that's very indicative of a non-democratic current with a lot of these surveillance technologies. So I would actually, I think there's room for debate about whether invasive programs have worked or not. It's just difficult as researchers to know because they're secretive. And so I think we could do that, and I think they might be doing it, but we need more research and abilities to do research on them to know, which again implies a more open government and even society.
Right. Danielle?
Yeah, and I want to go back, Dean and I, to the way you frame the question in a bit, the sense of, is this a balance between privacy and security? And I think that Amie and I spoke on a panel a few weeks ago that really interrogated this question, and I think that the question, as it's framed, makes it impossible to answer in favor of privacy, right? So if the question is, how do we balance between privacy and security, or is there a way to strike a balance? I find it hard to believe that anyone in this room would say, I would sacrifice my personal security for privacy. There may be some of you, and I applaud you, but I think that that really makes it a difficult question to answer. I think that we can have both. I think that we can have privacy in a secure world, and I think it in fact enhances privacy. It enhances security for us to respect privacy. And one of the ways that I want to illustrate that, and to also get to your question about schools and how we particularly protect folks in a world in which security is in question, right? We can look to, for example, about a decade after 9/11, the use of informants in communities and the FBI's mass use of informants in communities that were targeted and viewed as particularly at risk for violent behavior. And of course, we know what those communities were, right? They were American Muslim communities and people who were viewed to be Muslim. And to the point of the effect of surveillance is there, even if the surveillance is not functioning. So if the cameras aren't even on, we're still chilled. I think that we saw that in the use of informants. The FBI sent out tens of thousands of informants to communities. Nobody knew who was an informant. Nobody knew who was surveilling them. Nobody knew who was going to report them. And it chilled communities. It had a very tangible impact and harm on communities. And what a primary result was is that communities turned inward. And they stopped turning to entities and agencies and providers that they should be able to trust. And I think that that is what we're seeing in schools. And if we're deputizing teachers and counselors and social workers and mental health providers to report on what people are telling them, these people who are in positions of trust, and to violate the privacy that they are expected to hold for their students for merely expressing ideas, right? That's what it is. It's ideas, it's thoughts, it's feelings. It's not conduct. It's not ideas, and we have to draw the line between imminent risk or imminent threats and feelings of despair or feelings of hopelessness. If we continue to deputize folks to report on those feelings, which I think I certainly have felt before, and I think anyone in this room has felt feelings of hopelessness at one point in their lives, we push kids to turn inward, and we push people to turn inward and hide things more and not feel that they have places to turn to express these feelings and talk through them and get through them. And then we're risking not seeing where the perhaps conduct that we should be looking to arises.
Oh my, okay, I'm on. Another issue that envelops what we're talking about, I think, is has to do with the politics of all of this. It seems that we don't see a whole lot of difference between different administrations that in other ways are very starkly different politically. So could you comment on that, both in terms of the political tendencies that we see ordinarily and these programs, as well as where the larger public is and what they respond to within the political milieu? What their sentiments are about these and how that factors in.
I find it instructive that when I was fighting surveillance programs under the Obama administration, I was routinely called a Republican or a Libertarian. And as I fought surveillance programs under the Trump administration, I was used various negative terms to mean Democrat. the problem is surveillance itself is a nonpartisan issue. So is protest against surveillance. It's not something that connects to political parties, but it's something that is normally supported by those in power and opposed by those not in power.
So like presidential power by the administration.
It could be presidential power, depend what level you're looking at.
Yeah.
Right now it's presidential power.
Yeah.
And so what was put in place under the Bush administration, and Democrats spoke out very strongly against, when Obama was in power, became necessary and crucial and something that needed to be defended. I think there are two rationales behind this. One is a quote unquote not on my watch idea. We are not going to allow an attack to happen, and all of these surveillance mechanisms can help us prevent something from going wrong. We don't really know what that something may be, but it allows us to interact. And what backs up that perspective is the second one. We're okay. We, the people in power, know that we have good intentions, that we're only using these to be in the right ways, that we're respecting everybody who we're surveilling, and it's okay. Trust us. We hear trust us frequently. And that's a really interesting thing, because when everything is secret, you don't have any means to provide that trust. They're not being trustworthy. They're just asking for you to give them something with no grounds. And so we've pushed back against that a little bit. There have been some moves toward greater transparency, but it's way too hard still to determine how things are being used. And I think the people who were defending these programs under President Obama are now looking at how they're being utilized under President Trump, and they're really not happy about it. But they've laid the framework for that. I mean, President Obama had more espionage prosecutions than every single president before him combined. That has been picked up by the Trump administration. It is being used in ways that a lot of people don't agree with, but they have a hard time arguing against it because it's a trend that was started under Obama. We need to be looking ahead, but the people in power have a hard time.
Yeah, and just to maybe put that a little bit of a different way, once we ratchet these programs up, it's virtually impossible to bring them back down.
Right.
Yeah.
Paul, could you comment on in China, is there no political cost to this surveillance on steroids? Is the propaganda really working? I mean, we know, as you described the system as one that's oppressive, and there really aren't democratic levers, but there are politics of sorts that in Canada, and I mean in China, well, not Canada. And is there no political cost? Those are very different places. Is there no political cost?
Yeah, so, yeah, a few things. And I wanted to kind of link it back to the US too, because I think that's interesting as well. But yeah, I mean, you tend to get more pushback from local people when it gets into their immediate living space. So people are okay with cameras on the streets, and they can, but then the moment a camera, say, comes into their building or outside their apartment, then all of a sudden it becomes very real for them. And what's been interesting is we're just starting to, in the past couple of weeks, we've just started to see the first real major kind of full-throated voicing of people being upset over what has been a 3 to 4 year build out of a sort of massive surveillance system. But in the past couple of weeks, we've been going to people's sort of residential complexes and talking to them. And in maybe smaller cities, people say, well, you can't put a camera outside my door, but you can put a camera outside my building. But then in Shanghai, which is sort of one of the wealthier and most powerful kind of people in China, they say, well, you can't put a camera outside my building, but you can put it outside of my overall complex. And so different people in different areas have different kind of lines they're starting to draw. And there is a real kind of, you're beginning to have some realization of this, but overall there's a broad degree of trust, especially in the police and in the government. So the distrust actually comes from the companies, because everybody's had an experience with their phone number being sold, or with personal data leaking out, and then somebody say defrauding one of their family members or something like that. So people oftentimes blame the companies, and the government will blame the companies too, and then people are kind of too afraid to look squarely at the government itself, which is the largest collector of data, and put much blame there. So there's a bit of awareness, but it's not huge. The cost, I would say, is a solutionism cost, which is that technology doesn't solve problems. It just reinforces like the institutions that humans have set up. And within China, oftentimes those systems are based on kind of faulty ideas and biases. And so, one system would, a lot of the ways the police are using these systems is they make lists of people that they want to have on they kind of have local watch lists, right? So you have the watch lists that tend to sort of exist in communities are former drug users, people with mental handicaps, people who are foreign migrants from not from the area, basically unregistered people, people who have a history of political agitation, and then ethnic minorities. And so these groups are not necessarily, these are vulnerable peoples. These aren't necessarily people who are going to be the greatest existential threat to your system per se. Like if there's ever going to be somebody who's going to lead a local rebellion, it may not be somebody on those 5 lists. Those 5 lists don't necessarily constitute the greatest threat to the power of the Chinese Communist Party, and yet this is what they're policing. What it does is it gives you greater power and more assurance in your own biases. The real most startling example of that is we saw there was a facial recognition system that was programmed to identify Uyghurs, the Muslim minority, based on the way they look, right? So every single camera is looking as anybody walks by to see, are they Uyghur or aren't they Uyghur? And so it's a sort of automated system of racial targeting. And again, that doesn't, Uyghurs are not going to be a big threat in a lot of places to, communist power. It's just not, so you're putting a lot of resources into that when in reality, maybe there's other issues that you should be focused on, even if your aims are politically as narrow as just staying in power as the Chinese Communist Party. But the last point just to make is that I described China and it is dark and it is oppressive, but the US system, in particular, the way the US system handles data and centralizes data is much more effective than the Chinese. The Chinese is just sort of starting to set out on this, and the US capabilities are just far beyond what the Chinese can do in a lot of cases. So while we're sort of describing this thing, I like to think of it as the Chinese have a lot of eyes but less brains. The US has a lot of brains. And when you look at the consolidation of the data and the way that, there are apps that will give you, that will give law enforcement a ping to their smartphone when a car drives by a license plate tracker in the United States. And that's without a warrant. So there are things that are happening in the US that are more sophisticated and darker. It's just you live in a society where there's checks on that. And I think we're hopefully getting to a point now where people are starting to be aware that, they need to kind of exercise their rights on these issues. In China, that's not, nobody has really a choice here.
Okay, thanks. Now, I want to emphasize that you were speaking metaphorically with the eyes, brains thing, right? So, thanks for those comments. So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to open the discussion up to our audience. We have someone on the front row here. Please speak into a microphone. There are mics that'll be coming to you.
There's been a lot of conversation about centralized technology and its effect on cultural imperatives like trust and transparency and privacy. But there is a new revolution of technology coming down the road, blockchain technology, that is premised on decentralized technology, decentralized systems. Do you see blockchain technology having a major impact on transparency, privacy, and simplicity? Paul?
No. Well, I mean, so it's funny because China wants to have its own blockchain-based currency, but China controls it. So it's like, and because blockchain, if everything's written down on the ledger, you can kind of see what's happening, right? So there is a degree to which it can help authoritarians as much as it can undermine them. I think the greatest threat for China with these decentralized technologies is if somebody found a way to undermine the Chinese internet filters. So, the Chinese internet is entirely censored and basically at this point walled off from the world. So you have none of the social media sites you have in America available in China. And when people say things online, it gets censored constantly. So if there were a way, and it would be, you could do a blockchain version, so you could do some other decentralized way to get around it. But if there were a way to undermine the internet filters that China has set up and render them ineffective, that would be an extremely powerful pushback to Chinese power. What's interesting is a lot of US companies that probably would have the ability to do that don't dare, because the market power of China is such that you wouldn't really want to give them that kind of a black eye. Even a company like Facebook, which is blocked in China, does billions of dollars in business there because Chinese companies and governments want to advertise to the world. So Facebook has no presence in China on an internet level, yet it's its largest market in Asia for outbound ads. And so you could get these things, but it would take a really major push from a very large and well entity with a lot of resources, and nobody with those resources wants to threaten the power base that is China. So,
yeah, thank you. Any more questions? Is there someone? Yeah, right here in the front. I got you.
I don't want to barrage Paul with questions here, but I read an article recently it was by Business Insider regarding the social credit system in China and the implementation of the security cameras and sort of facial recognition, gate detecting, all of these things together to sort of assign different social credit values to people based on their actions and the purchases they make in stores and whether those purchases are positive or negative for the people around them. Do you think that that's even realistic, or is that more of this sort of propaganda that China is trying to push?
Yeah, so social credit is complicated. A lot of times coverage of China sort of falls into, there's the ability to just, I feel like books like 1984 are great because they raise awareness about issues, but they also create a sort of rubric in our mind that we try to, a narrative that we try to fit reality into because we're looking for parallels. And social credit did that very precisely, especially with Black Mirror, this TV show. And the idea, the idea behind social credit is basically the Chinese government collects all this data on what you buy, how you live, and then gives you or takes away privileges depending on how it judges you to be behaving. In reality, that's not what social credit is. Social credit is basically a large data collection effort, especially on businesses, but also on people, because China doesn't actually have credit. You think of your like FICO score and all these sorts of things. That doesn't exist in China. People have had to really don't have credit cards either. So the idea is to build out for the first time some kind of a credit system, and a part of that, because it's the Communist Party, is linked to social, the way you are socially. But in a way, America's credit systems are no different. There's all kinds of things that are about your personal life that affect your credit score. So I would say social credit is overbuilt, and it's not the way it's been portrayed. And this is why I come back to the Chinese police, because the Chinese police, the real place where this stuff is happening, where families are being punished for the behavior of a single person, where you're being banished from things, where you're being added to lists that you don't even know you're on, and privileges are being taken away, comes much more from the police acting on their own through these opaque technological systems than it does from social credit, which actually, like the social credit system, doesn't even have any biometric information. So they don't even know how to identify you. They don't know how tall you are. They don't know what your face looks like, whereas the police have all of that data. So a lot of what social credit is doing is set up to solve issues with personal debt and people loaning each other money, and companies doing bad things and then being punished for it. It could go in a dark place, like it definitely could, but we just haven't seen it yet. And there's no actual social credit scores. Like no person in China has a credit score, except for in a very few small areas where they're experimenting with it. And even in those places, nobody was aware of the scores. So it hasn't been a meaningful impact on Chinese sort of social life or political life, whereas the way the police act has very much been. So I would focus more on that, although it's hard because it's one of the greatest, I think, failures that Western media has had on China in the past few years, has been the kind of bigging up of this social credit thing. So yeah.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for the question. There's a questioner in the back there.
I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I've been doing it, and a proud CU alum, so there we go.
All right.
But the one thing that I've noticed in a lot of my cases is I'm seeing more and more surveillance that's warrantless, and also the technology is really expanding. There's a lot of technology that was developed for the military that's filtering down to DEA and local drug task force. And there's no judicial oversight of a lot of this. A lot of the surveillance that's done by law enforcement is done without any kind of warrants, without any, and the Fourth Amendment, what I see, is being really trampled on from my perspective at least, because what you see is you see police using technology, and it's just the nuclear arms race type of thing, where as soon as you learn of one technology, there's 3 things out there, and you don't even realize that the technology is being used until you talk to your clients and they say, oh yeah, you know, this kind of happened. And when we get the discovery, which they're supposed to turn over, they are very reluctant to turn it over, any of the technology that they use, and they don't want to expose it. And so I think it's a fallacy if we think in our country that the courts are protecting our Fourth Amendment rights. And the woman in the white shirt, I think the ACLU, because I've used their information that they've been able to get out to be able to try to find out what type of surveillance that law enforcement's using. And I think it's becoming a growing problem in this country.
Danielle, would you like to comment on that?
I completely agree with you. I think that the judicial remedies are few and far between for these issues. I think that we have to we being lawyers and particularly litigators have to turn away from the courts as having all of the answers and providing all of the protections, because they're not. And I don't have anything uplifting to say on that point, unfortunately.
I mean, there is, though. We on our panel a few weeks ago, you should have all been there, we talked about we are seeing people fighting back against this type of surveillance. So it started with the US v. Jones case, which is a case in DC where police affixed a GPS tracker onto a car and tracked a target for 30 days without a warrant, or at least they had a warrant, but it wasn't valid when it was exercised. And the court said, actually, no, you're not allowed to do that. You have to get a warrant for that sort of tracking. The subsequent case, the Carpenter case, took that a bit further, where there wasn't a physical device. They were using geolocation information from your cell phone. And the trend is toward trying to recognize an expectation of privacy in some of this so-called public information, the information you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in. And it will be interesting to see where that trend goes, if it gets out of the location information space and into this more ambient information, the cameras that are collecting your information as you walk up the street, biometric information that's available whenever I take a picture of the audience. There's going to be some real interesting casework in the next few years on this. And we might have to analyze our entire theory of the Fourth Amendment in light of the level of surveillance that's being done. But the trend is back the other direction, I think.
And I would just add, yeah, no, you're right. And I think that part of the despair on that front comes when we pit this as a security versus privacy question. Because once you get to the point where you're in criminal discovery, or if you're doing impact litigation involving allegations of terrorism, the answer is going to be security 9 times out of 10.
Keith, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add another issue with there relative to courts, is that some of the technology, there's sometimes too big of a faith among judges in the technology as well. So if we look at DNA technology, which is often used to confirm as evidence that someone did it, and defense lawyers will ask for sort of what's the algorithms that are going into some analysis technology which is being used to make the determinations of guilt, as it were. And the companies will argue that that's proprietary information, and judges have, by and large, sort of agreed to that argument that we can't really break open these black boxes because it's proprietary. I think that's an unanticipated challenge we're also facing, but at least we can think about more open source technology as ways in which we could cast a more critical eye to the roles that technology is playing in criminal matters, at least.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Right here, yeah? Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, yeah, wait, sorry.
Sorry if this is more of a tangential question. I really liked what you were talking about security versus privacy. I've focused a lot about that in just terms of reading about Benjamin Franklin and the USA Patriot Act. And one of Benjamin Franklin's quotes was that when you try and remove a little bit of liberty for a little bit of security, you end up with neither. And I've seen numerous cases throughout U.S. history where the federal government has used searches or knowledge against free speech to end up turning against those groups. So like the Alien Sedition Act, the Sedition Act in the early 1900s, and McCarthyism. And the USA Patriot Act has specific provisions like roving wiretaps, national security letters, that I think have very broad reaches. And specifically with the Fisa court, I've seen how they've rejected like 4 over the past 8 years of tens of thousands of requests. And I'm curious if you think the Freedom Act of like 2014 is enough to limit the powers of the USA Patriot Act, or where would you go in striking a balance between privacy and security in terms of like reversing USA Patriot Act, or if you support it entirely? Sorry if that's a very broad question.
Right, no, I think it's pretty.
I'm going to let Amie answer this question, but just say that you probably should have been on the panelist. That was a great question.
The Freedom Act is the law that's going to expire at the end of the year if it's not renewed, that people are pushing for. I thought that it was the most comprehensive reform we got in this country since the 1970s. A lot of people pushed for it. I think we were right pushing for it. I don't think it was enough, and I think the abuse we've seen since then says that. And so we're going to need to go a ton further. Unfortunately, surveillance always affects first, hardest, longest, the most marginalized communities. There's a great conference out of Georgetown yesterday that if you didn't watch it, Georgetown Law Center, you should go back and watch it, called The Color of Surveillance, about surveillance of poor communities. Before that, they've done surveillance of other communities, and these are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of it. We need to think, I think, of these as communal interests. When any of us gives up a little bit of privacy, it impacts everybody. And when we look at these laws, I think we have to see their impact as one for society. I'm hoping this law goes away because it hasn't done anything, as I said before. And we need to look at more comprehensive surveillance reform. Instead of doing, let's look at this law expiring this year and this law expiring this year, and we're going to split them all up to try to tell you that they're all really important. We should look at them all together in a comprehensive photo of what the U.S. is doing inside and outside.
Thanks. And I think the uplifting message that comes from this discussion is that we have a lot of bright minds thinking about these issues, including young people and others more experienced. I want to thank each of our panelists for terrific presentations and a terrific discussion. Special shout out to Paul, who's joined us from Hong Kong. And I want to acknowledge that, the press is under a lot of criticism and pressure these days. But I for one, want to thank you for all that you do and the important work that you and other journalists do in bringing us the news.
Thanks.
So thank you,
And the
Paul.
sun is up here now. So.
Thanks again to all those who put their hard work to organizing this terrific event. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks finally once again to the Rosenblooms for their sponsorship and generosity. And this will be followed by reception through these doors over here. If you're not going to the reception, please exit through the same door that you came in. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you for coming.